We were talking earlier, and since I live in Southwest Florida, it's sort of nice to get out of Southwest Florida, which is paradise most months, but it's nice to experience a little chilly weather and get a reminder about what that's like. Also, my mom lives in Muncie, and so I sort of spent a long weekend with her there, and it was really nice to just be up here in the area. So thanks for the invitation. It worked out in every way. I want to tell you a little bit about my research with fair trade coffee, and a couple of things about this field. When I first started reading about it seriously about 10 years ago, it was sort of a young field that people in economics were doing research about. So it wasn't that hard. It was a pretty low-cost hurdle for an economist like me to get up to speed and pretty much check out everything that anybody's done about fair trade coffee. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot really quickly, and I became really rapidly just about as knowledgeable as anybody else when it came to fair trade coffee. The other thing I want to tell you is I didn't really know much about fair trade coffee when I started. I think like most American consumers, I'd seen the label, I sort of knew that it meant something and it was supposed to help poor people somewhere, but I didn't know exactly how that worked. And I just wanted to understand it better. And so as I read everything there was to read in the economics literature, I also thought about this lady that I used to attend church with. And her name was Elaine. Oh, this is being recorded. Her name is Mary. I know it's too late. We'll call her Mary. You can edit that later, right?
I don't know.
It's totally fine. Let's call her Mary. Mary's great. Mary is the sort of person that I wish I would be on my best day, because that's how great she is, so that even on my worst day I would still be a better person. And Elaine was the person in the church that I attended in Michigan who was instrumental in getting fair trade coffee sold in between services. So her heart was in the right place. She wanted to help poor people. Nobody was paying her to do this. She gave generously of her time. She gave generously of her talents. And she made it possible for people that we went to church with to purchase this caring coffee in between services. And so the more I read about fair trade, and then especially when I sat down to write, I always kept in mind Elaine, also known as Mary. I also always kept her in mind because regardless of what I learned as an economist about fair trade, I knew that people like my friend Elaine cared. And they wanted to make a difference in the life of the global poor. So regardless of what I learned about fair trade and whether or not it's effective, I wanted to make sure that whatever I learned, I was communicating it as though I were communicating it to Elaine. So I didn't have Elaine's photograph by my computer, but it was almost like I did, because I always thought, how would I write this in a way that would be engaging to Elaine and would respect her and what she's trying to do when it comes to fair trade coffee and also caring for the global poor. So that's how I got started. So have you seen this label before, the fair trade label? Can you advance? Maybe?
Give me a second.
Okay, it worked a minute ago.
All right. I don't know what you did.
Yeah, it worked just great. It worked good.
Yeah, I can't get it. I'll flip it for you.
Okay.
Just tell me when to go.
Okay, so go ahead and flip it. So have you seen this label before? This is the fair trade label. Anywhere you go, anywhere in the world, if you want an assurance that coffee was grown in an honest way and that the growers are producing high quality goods and getting paid better than the market price in many cases, this is the label that you see. So for older members of the audience like me, this works sort of like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval used to 40 years ago. If you saw this, you knew that an independent agency, reviewers and raters at Good Housekeeping magazine, they checked out the product and they could give it their endorsement. And it was safe, it was high quality, and you had some recourse if anything happened with that product. This label works sort of the same way. When you see that on a pack of coffee, you're given some basic assurances that coffee growers on the other side of the market, they're small-scale growers who work together in cooperatives. So they don't work on their own, they work with other small coffee growers in their villages. And they govern themselves, the cooperative, they're governed democratically. So that's one of the guarantees that you get from the seal. Another one is that everybody who works in producing the coffee that's in the bag or in the cup that you're drinking with that seal on it, everybody's paid at least the local minimum wage. So democratic governance of a small cooperative, local minimum wage, no child labor, No coffee is grown in a protected rainforest. These are some of the basic guarantees that you get. But the big one is that the coffee growers who are part of the Fair Trade Network, they're given a guaranteed minimum price per pound, regardless of what happens to the market price of coffee. So when you see that label, you trust, right? There's a lot of trust that's required to believe in that label. So how do you get the trust? Well, this label is the same all over the world. So if you buy fair trade coffee in Poland, it's got this label on it. If you buy fair trade coffee in the United Kingdom, it's got this label on it. Fair trade Canada, it's got this label on it. Now, every nation controls the use of its particular seal in that country, but there's an international organization that controls the use of that seal, and they also operate their own independent auditing and monitoring certification program. And they'll visit coffee growers and make sure that, yeah, there's democratic governance. Make sure that, yeah, children aren't being used or it's not being grown in a rainforest. So they work really, really hard to make sure that when you see that label, it's just not just a pretty picture on the coffee bag. It really means something. But again, as a consumer, you can't observe those things directly. You have to trust that when you see the CEO, the certifying organization for Fair Trade International, they've done their job in monitoring and making sure everybody's compliant. So, Feller, you want to hit it? And I've got tricky slides, so that's good.
Okay.
Oh, back up.
Back up? All right. Right there.
So, one thing that's really interesting to think about then is, it really is sort of like there's a monopoly on the use of this seal, right? If there really is only one international organization, Fair Trade International, that controls the use of the seal worldwide, and then every individual country uses a version of the seal for their specific country, then the idea is wherever you go in the world, if you go through a drive-through in Poland and it's got that seal on the side of the cup as you leave the McDonald's drive-through, oh, you know it's Fair Trade coffee and you know what that means. Same thing is true in Fair Trade Canada or Fair Trade UK. All over the world, it's all licensed by the same licensor, same label. It also means then that this is kind of a monopoly, right? You can't really buy fair trade coffee from anybody else besides Fair Trade International because they're the ones that control the seal. They're the ones with a large monitoring and compliance organization to make sure that all of the coffee that you purchase with the sticker on it really is what you're promised when you see that sticker. So I like to think about this as an economist, but I also like to think about it as just a good person. So if you're in the grocery store or if you're in your coffee shop and you're trying to decide whether or not to buy fair trade coffee, you sort of first face a moral question. And the moral question is like this. You found one coffee, you haven't tried it before, looks great, try to smell around that one-way valve and it smells pretty great. You text your friends, you look up reviews online, and the coffee you're about to purchase sounds really great and it fits your budget great. And you're all ready to buy that high-quality, delicious coffee. And just as you're about to take it off the grocery store shelf or take it out of the bin at your local coffee shop, you see another coffee next to it. And it's got the Fair Trade seal on it. So you haven't heard of it before, but you do the same thing. Message your friends, look up the reviews online. Sounds like it's just as delicious. Sounds like you're going to really enjoy it too. But you notice that the price point is different. You notice that maybe the one on the right, the Fair Trade labeled coffee, is, let's say, 40 cents a pound more. Well, all of a sudden now you face a moral, ethical choice. Because one way to think of that coffee on the right is, feller, oh, this is the coffee that good people that care about the poor buy. So what do you do now? Is it worth it to you to pay an extra, say, 40 cents a pound for coffee that's just as high in quality, but now has this seal on the front instead? Now, I don't know about you, but I like to think of myself as a good person. I also like it when you think of me as a good person. And so I might be very, very persuaded to buy this coffee because my friend Elaine thinks it's really important. And I might even be tempted to bring a Fair Trade coffee mug into class with me at the beginning of the semester because I like to feel good inside when I do the right thing and buy Fair Trade coffee. But I also don't mind if other people notice that Professor Claar is the kind of guy who thinks it's important to pay extra for coffee. So I might have a more engaged class, I might have a more manageable class, and at the end of the semester I might even have higher reviews in ratemyprofessors.com. That's the gold standard. But the moral decisions don't end there, so feller. If we get this down, we can take the show on the road. So the moral decisions don't end there, because you're just about to buy maybe the fair trade coffee. So you put away the one that's not caring or not good person coffee, and you now have the one that's good person coffee. But you notice next to it there are other good person coffees. Feller, there's certified organic coffee, and good caring people buy organic coffee. Or maybe you see another one that says that it's rainforest friendly, it's bird friendly, and so you got these 3 labels, and they all work kind of the same way. They all have monitoring, they all make sure that they're grown under the promised conditions. Well, what's a caring person to do now? Triple his coffee consumption every day to be a good person? I don't know about you, but that would make me really, really nervous, and I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, not only because I'd had too much caffeine, because I'm worrying about whether I'd made the right moral choice. So what I want to do then is I want to talk a little bit about the coffee market in particular, and why we have fair trade coffee and not fair trade in, say, other goods and services. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Now I'm going to talk and focus today on coffee because it's the original fair trade product, and it's the one by far with the biggest market share, both internationally and within the United States. Now today you can buy from Fair Trade International. You can buy fair trade sugar, fair trade tea, fair trade chocolate, fair trade bananas, fair trade soccer balls. There are lots of things that you can buy with that same label on it. But I'll focus on coffee because it was the original, and it also by far is the biggest worldwide. So what is it about coffee that requires a unique solution? Why do we have fair trade coffee and not fair trade in other goods and services besides the ones that I mentioned? So go ahead and change the slide. To understand that, it's helpful to know just a couple of basics about coffee and coffee production. Essentially, though there are lots of varieties of beans, there are basically 2 kinds, Robustas and Arabicas. Have you ever had a cup of coffee that was so great you'll never forget it? Anybody? Did it have lemon in it? That's an inside joke from lunch today, some of you know. Have you ever had a cup of coffee that was just so great you're never going to forget it? Yeah, we'll have to talk afterward, because I'd love to hear about this cup of coffee, yeah? It was probably made with Arabica beans. Arabica beans are highly prized in the coffee market. They have a mellow flavor. It takes about 3 to 5 years for a new coffee plant that's an Arabica plant to be ready for the harvest. And you can't grow them just anywhere. They're suited to small-scale production at high elevations, so places like Brazil and Colombia. Widely known for their high-quality coffees, they mostly are Arabica beans. Let me ask the opposite question. Have you ever had a cup of coffee so nasty, you're never going to be able to forget it? Okay. We'll have to talk afterward also, because sometimes these stories are more memorable than the great stories, or the painful experiences. Those were probably made with Robusta beans, and just like they sound, they're robust. They are weather resistant, they are fungus resistant. You can grow them at lots of different elevations as long as the climate is right. So people like to talk about the bean belt, and what they mean by the bean belt is a latitude range right around the equator where you can grow lots of coffees, and some of those places have high elevations like Brazil and Colombia. Some have lower elevations like places in Central and West Africa. So lower elevations, and you can grow lots of beans. In the picture here you see that the yellow shaded countries are mainly Arabicas, and the dark green shaded nations are mostly Robustas. And then the ones that are shaded sort of light green, they're able to produce both coffees. So that's really helpful to know that there are basically 2 kinds of beans. One is delicious and takes a long time to mature for the harvest. The other one is not so delicious, but it does have more caffeine, and the plants do mature more quickly. They're ready to go in 2 to 3 years for the harvest once they've been planted. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Fowler. So as an economist, when you start to really dig in and press people who think fair trade is great, well, why coffee? Why not every other good or every other service that's produced by poor people? And the answer often is, well, coffee prices are really volatile. And if you're a poor person and you're planting your coffee crop that's going to mature in 3 to 5 years, it's really tough if you're already poor to know what you're going to be able to charge at the end of the growing season several years away. So if we give coffee growers a minimum guaranteed price per pound for their coffee that's grown in the fair trade network, that'll take away some of that risk and uncertainty that they face. So that's the other guarantee that you get from that fair trade label that we talked about a minute ago, in addition to no child labor or the local minimum wage. When you purchase that coffee, you know that the coffee growers participating in the Fair Trade Network are getting a guaranteed minimum price for coffee regardless of what happens to the world price. And if the world price does go above that guaranteed minimum, everybody gets the world price. So champions of fair trade coffee, they say the coffee prices are too volatile and you just can't know from year to year what you'll be able to get for your crop at the end of the year, given that there's a worldwide market for coffee. The other claim that champions of fair trade coffee make is that coffee prices are just too low and you're never going to be able to have anything close to a middle-class lifestyle if your primary gig is growing coffee. So let's take a look at the data. This is my one data chart. So go ahead and change that fella. So here's a diagram and you see two lines. The orange line that you see there is the spot price of coffee. So the contemporary daily price of coffee for really good beans, Arabica beans, Class C beans on the New York Coffee Exchange. And that orange line is the price. And you see that on the vertical axis we've got the price of a pound of these Arabica bean coffees. And it's priced in pennies per pound. And the time series starts out at the beginning of the fair trade movement. And we'll talk about the history in a second. So beginning in 1989, all the way forward till, middle of 2016. And look at that orange line. Coffee prices move around a lot. And now take a look at those four spikes. You've got one in the middle of the 90s, another one about 1997, huge price spike in 2010, 2011, and then another smaller spike in 2013, 2014. See those? So as an economist, I can tell you that when coffee prices spike, it's normally for one of four reasons. This is going to require a lot of coordination, fella. Ready?
Right.
One reason might be, hit it, bad weather in Latin America. A second reason might be, hit it, bad weather in Latin America. The third reason might be, bad weather in Latin America, and any guesses for the fourth reason? Bad weather in Latin America. So think about that. If part of the coffee crop is destroyed by flood or by drought, then immediately, bam, that portion of the coffee crop is wiped out. You're destroyed if it was your crop, but this is great news if it was somebody else's crop, because there's less coffee in the market that year, and you'll be able to command a higher price. So I know as an economist who studied coffee prices, when the prices spike, it drives up the market price of coffee. I also know another thing from economics. It's that when prices go up and stay up, like they did in the 90s with those two successive spikes, other people not currently doing the thing that now has a higher price will start doing more of the thing that has a higher price. The economists would say that the high price induces a supply response. So take a look at what happens. Don't even click it yet, fella. What happens to the price of coffee after those two big spikes in the 90s? What happens to the orange line? Collapse. Total price, it goes down below, it goes down to 50 cents per pound of coffee. So fabulously low commodity price. What happened there? Now you can click it. People in Vietnam who weren't really growing coffee before the 1990s lived in the right latitude range, saw the high prices of coffee in the mid-90s, and they started to grow coffee, a lot more coffee. Now, if you looked in the 1980s at the list of the top 5 coffee growing nations, Vietnam wasn't even there at the time. They weren't a player at all. But today, because of their increase in flooding the market here in the late 90s and early 2000s, and they've continued to do that, they're now, depending on the year, either the number 2 or the number 3 coffee grower in the world. And they got started after those 2 price spikes in the 90s. Now there's another line in the diagram, and the other line in the diagram is the fair trade coffee price. Now remember what I said. If the world price goes above the minimum, everybody gets the world price. But if the world price plummets like it did in the early 2000s when Vietnam came into the market, then there's a guaranteed minimum. And that's the flat line section. That kicks in, and if you're a fair trade coffee grower, you get that minimum price. And that minimum today per pound is $1.60. So in many ways, this is a way for coffee growers to get a little insurance against what might happen to the price of coffee at the end of the growing season. It's also true that regardless of what happens to the price of coffee, whether it's above or below that guaranteed minimum, everybody gets an additional 20 cents per pound if you're participating in the Fair Trade Network, and you can use that extra 20 cents for projects in your village. And again, the cooperatives, since they're democratic, they would vote and decide whether to do clean water projects or healthcare projects or educational projects. So that's why you'll notice, especially over here on the right side of the diagram, there's almost always a gap between, even when the lines are moving together and you're above the minimum, That blue line is just a little bit higher because of the extra 20 cents. So people who think fair trade coffee is great, they're right. Coffee prices move around a lot, and they do stay low. Over that entire time period, looks like the average price is probably, what, $1.50 or so per pound, and hasn't really changed over the last several decades. Great. Next slide. So I'm an economist. I'm going to have one supply-demand diagram, okay? So here it is. So I'm modeling the market for coffee, and I've drawn both the supply curve and the demand curve. What does their shape tell you? Econ students, what sort of shape did I give those? So when the price changes, do the quantities change with either of those curves? Do they change by very much? No. And when that's true, what do we say? The demand and the supply are price? Inelastic, thanks very much. Yeah, price inelastic. And this makes sense. How long did I tell you it takes for a new Arabica plant to be ready?
3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years. So if the price of coffee spikes, even though people might like to supply a lot more coffee, they can't today because it takes 3 to 5 years to plant new coffee plants that are ready for the harvest. So the supply curve obeys the law of supply, higher prices, more coffee, but not much more coffee in a fixed amount of time. And then on the demand side, we assume that regardless of what happens to the market price of coffee, the demand stays pretty much the same. I don't know about you, I have a 3-cup-a-day habit, and even if the price of coffee were 50% off, I wouldn't double my coffee consumption daily as a consequence. So I might drink a little more coffee, but I wouldn't drink a lot more coffee. So I've got very steep curves here to show that suppliers respond to higher prices, but they can't respond by very much very quickly. And consumers will respond, but they won't respond by very much very quickly on average. So let's do one example. I don't know, bad weather in South America. Feller hit it. I like this. I like our relationship. We shock the supply curve, hit it again. It moves to the left because coffee crops are destroyed completely. And what happens to the market price of that coffee? It goes up, way up. And so if you're trying to ever explain to your friends why commodity prices sometimes fluctuate a lot, it's almost always because you're putting together really inelastic supply, really inelastic demand, and little tiny movements in either curve result in big shifts in that price. Same thing is true for oil prices. So Feller, go ahead and switch it. Again, just a reminder that not only can you not grow more coffee that's ready for the harvest for 3 to 5 years after the price has gone up, remember that there's only a limited latitude range in which you can grow coffee. Right? So we don't grow coffee in Ohio, we don't grow it in Indiana, we grow it within that fairly narrow latitude range, which makes the supply also pretty price inelastic. Feller? So at this point it's helpful to ask, so why do we have fair trade? Why do we not have fair trade broccoli? We don't have fair trade peaches. Why is it that we have fair trade coffee, and how did it get started? So let me tell you just a short history of fair trade coffee. Before fair trade coffee, let's go back to the beginning of the 1900s. There was really only one major global producer of high-quality Arabicas, and it was the nation of Brazil. They supplied most of the globe, especially North America and Western Europe, with coffee. But because they were the serious major player, they had some monopoly power in that market. So from year to year, they would manipulate how many bags of their crop they actually put into the market that year. So in one notorious year, in 1937, the government of Brazil set fire to 11 million bags of coffee. Because they'd grown so much that year, what did they want to do? Make less available in the market so that they could charge a premium price for that coffee. And that particular year, I think only 30% of the crop, in fact, made it into the market. So they literally set fire to millions of bags of their coffee to drive up the price. So what do monopolies do like Brazil? They produce less, and then they can charge more and increase total revenue. Colombia saw what Brazil was doing, and they decided, well, you know, we grow really high quality coffees. We don't have the name brand recognition yet that Brazil does, but hey, there's television, there's radio. Let's start to grow our own coffees and let's promote them really, really actively so that people living in Ohio and Indiana learn that there are other great coffees out there besides the ones that come from Brazil. So does anybody recognize this person here in the graphic? Oh, do you know his name? Juan Valdez. So Juan Valdez was the official seal of Café de Colombia, which was the national label for high-quality, mountain-grown Arabica beans from Colombia. And there weren't a lot of commercials on TV in the 50s and 60s and 70s for Brazilian coffee, but there were a lot for rich Colombian coffee. And when you saw Juan Valdez and his trusty burro, you knew that these were high-quality coffees and you should purchase them. So, do you think Brazil liked this? That all of a sudden Colombia was growing a lot of coffee and marketing it really creatively in places where people like I could see it when I was growing up? No, they thought this was terrible. And so, after Brazil, after Colombia, other coffee growing nations started to enter the market and compete too. Peru, Guatemala, West African nations started to enter the market. Well, if you're Brazil, this is really bad news. You've got a lot of competition now, a lot of countries producing coffee, and what's that going to do to your price? It's going to drive it down. You can set fire to your own coffee, but you can't set fire to other countries' coffee. So this set the stage for something called the International Coffee Agreement. During a conference that was organized by the United Nations in, again, 1962, coffee-producing nations agreed to set up a quota system so that every year the countries that signed on to the quota system would promise not to produce more than their specified quota in that particular year. Oh, now we're back to a monopoly situation, right? Now you have dozens of coffee-producing nations, but they've all decided to voluntarily restrict for the good of the cartel, restrict their output every year so that the market price is artificially high, and everybody will be able to get a price that's higher than the market price would be otherwise. So why did the UN set this up, and why did countries like the United States agree to pay these higher prices? This was the middle of the Cold War, and there were some serious Marxist threats in Latin America, and the United States, as part of its diplomacy, wanted to keep coffee growers in places like Latin America happy. And so European nations, the United States, they went ahead and signed off also on the International Coffee Agreement. It meant higher prices, but maybe it would also reduce the risk of other, more serious dangers as a consequence. So, next slide. But by the end of the 1980s, the United States was a whole lot less worried about Marxist threats in Latin America than it had been 20 or 30 years before. So the International Coffee Agreement fell apart. Countries weren't willing to voluntarily pay these artificially high prices that the International Coffee Agreement put in place. So it fell apart, coffee prices plummeted, and even though the United States was less concerned with Marxist threats in general in Latin America, the United States was still really interested in what was going to happen in Nicaragua in the late 1980s. And so the United States imposed a trade embargo, and it was illegal to import goods and services from the nation of Nicaragua, including coffee. As you might imagine, if you're a poor coffee grower in Nicaragua, this is really, really, really bad news. So this set up the first U.S. importer of fair trade labeled coffee called Equal Exchange. And you've seen their logo, right? The red label there with the two arrows. Biggest coffee importer of fair trade coffee in the United States, and also the first. Housed in Boston, they exploited a trade loophole, and they were able to take coffee beans that originated in Nicaragua, sort of launder them internationally through coffee markets, and eventually get them into the U.S. and do it lawfully. So that was the first fair trade label in the United States. At about the same time, there were some entrepreneurial coffee growers in the Mexican state of Oaxaca who were just looking for more people to buy their coffee. So they worked with an international aid organization, and they established the first national fair trade label. And it's the one that you see there today. In the Netherlands, they don't call it Fair Trade Netherlands, they call it Fair Trade Max Havelaar. And Max Havelaar is a character in a famous book in the Netherlands. And so citizens in the Netherlands, they recognized this name and they used it for the fair trade label. So that's how it got going. So next slide, Colin. But all of this leaves open the question, so are we making a difference in the life of this guy, right? If the honest, hardworking coffee grower that you're never going to meet, and you're going to buy the coffee, you're going to see the label. But if the whole point is to make a difference in the lives of the global poor, we might make ourselves feel good inside when we buy fair trade coffee. But a more important, more serious question is whether or not we're making his life better, because, again, that's the point. So next slide. There's a lot of marketing research about fair trade coffee, and this was all really new to me. I was interested in the econ research, but I didn't know much about the marketing side. But on the marketing side, it turns out that you can think of fair trade coffee as product bundling. And if you've taken a marketing course, you know what this is. Bundling is when you're faced with the possibility of buying good A, and you could also buy good B. A third option could be to buy good A and good B bundled together as a package deal. And so it's possible to think of fair trade coffee as a package deal, right? Not only do you get sweet, delicious, aromatic coffee that will impress your friends, in addition, maybe you're getting some charity or some justice for the global poor. But since you can't really observe the global poor directly who brew your coffee, you really have to have really strong faith in that fair trade label. Another possibility is that when you buy fair trade coffee, you're investing in what economists like to refer to as social capital. So I talked earlier about walking into my class with my fair trade coffee mug, and things go really nicely for me the rest of the semester. What if I invite my colleagues from the Department of Economics and Finance over to my house? And I invite them into the kitchen for a cup of coffee after dinner, and what do I make sure, what bags do I leave out on the counter? Equal exchange. Heck, I could even serve them regular coffee and just have the equal exchange bag out, and it would have the intended effect. And if they also think that, oh, Victor's a really great guy, then if I invest in that virtue, people call it virtue signaling now. Virtue signaling, right, it's costly, I don't have to do it. If they think that I'm a great guy, then that might pay off for me later in some ways. So my youngest son knows that I really like snarky t-shirts, so he gave me this one. It's black, fits really good, silk screen is thick. And what does the language say? Proceeds from this t-shirt benefit my image, right? So I'm sending a signal that I'm a good person, but yeah, that's really what the investment is about. It might help poor people along the way, but that's not my primary concern. So next slide. Another way to think of it from an economics perspective is that fair trade coffee could be a form of price discrimination. And if you're students of economics, you know that price discrimination is charging different people different prices for the same good or service. This is why movies are really, really cheap if you can go at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. And they're really expensive if you go at 7:30 or 9:30 on Friday and Saturday night. Most people have better things to do at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday than go to the movies. Same thing is true for airline flights, hotel reservations and rooms. Student discounts are a form of price discrimination, right? If you don't have a student ID card, you can't get the lower price that people like me have to pay. Oh, and if you have hair that's my color, you can get a senior discount on that cup of coffee at McDonald's. So you could think of fair trade coffee as a form of price discrimination. And there's a really gifted economist and journalist named Tim Harford. His most famous book is called The Undercover Economist. And he also writes for the British newspaper, the Financial Times. And he loves coffee, he's a big fan, he likes to drink cappuccino, and his favorite coffee shop in the UK is Costa Coffee. And he noticed down at Costa that the price differential between a cappuccino that wasn't labeled as fair trade at his coffee shop and one that was really high, like 25 cents per cup. Now, Harford had seen the numbers, right? The coffee growers themselves were getting, what, about $1.50 per pound of coffee? And it doesn't take that much coffee to make a single cup of cappuccino. So he couldn't figure out how they were justifying a 25-cent differential between the fair trade certified cappuccino and the one that wasn't. So he's a journalist, he calls up Costa's corporate offices, and he makes an inquiry. Costa eventually made the prices of the two coffees the same because they couldn't justify the difference based on the cost structure. So the way that Harford puts this in his book is he says this: if you turned up and you bought fair trade coffee, you sent two messages to Costa. Now one, they weren't that interested in. And the message they weren't that interested in was, I think fair trade coffee is important and it's a cause that should be supported. The other message that Costa Coffee was a whole lot more interested in was, I don't mind paying a higher price as long as you give me a persuasive reason to pay a higher price. So again, they couldn't justify the cost differential and they made the prices the same. Valerie. So you've seen the fair trade label, now you know a little bit about the coffee market, and you know what the seal represents for you as a coffee consumer. So what I'll do is I'll close by telling you a little bit more about how fair trade operates, that Fair Trade International doesn't conceal, but they also don't advertise it to you prominently. And then I'll also tell you a little bit, now that we've had a couple of decades of fair trade coffee, whether or not it seems like it's making a difference in the lives of the global poor. So the first thing that you probably haven't been told is that if you're a cooperative of small coffee growers in Tanzania or Peru, Mexico, it's really expensive just to apply to join the Fair Trade Coffee Network. In fact, because exchange rates change and all of the contracts are in euros, I looked it up Thursday. Right now, if you're a cooperative of poor coffee growers, it costs $600 just to apply to join the network. Now think about that, $600 and you're a poor coffee grower, even if you're in Peru where the per capita GDP is about $5,000 or $6,000, $600 application fee is a pretty steep charge. And if you're a coffee grower in a nation like Tanzania where the per capita income per year is $500, getting you and your coffee growing friends in the cooperative to pony up $600, that's really, really hard to do. So I don't know about you, but my intuition is that if you really wanted to help poor people, the first step wouldn't be to demand that they pay you hundreds of dollars. Now, why do they do this? They do it because, and you have to think about it from the grower's perspective here, if you do get to join the Fair Trade Network, you get a guaranteed minimum price, regardless of what happens to the world price. And again, if you're currently poor, knowing that there is a bottom limit to what the price is going to be for your coffee crop that year, that's really nice. You take that risk that you would have held yourself, and you offload it onto somebody else. So it makes sense that this is an attractive idea to cooperatives of small coffee growers. But here's the other thing. On the other side of the market, suppose that Fair Trade International reviews your application, happily accepts your $600. There's no guarantee that somebody like Equal Exchange on the other side of the market is going to purchase some or any of your coffee. In fact, in one notorious case, a cooperative of coffee growers in the Mexican state of Oaxaca, they looked for 8 years, once they'd been approved as fair trade coffee growers, for somebody who was willing to purchase their coffee under the guaranteed conditions, including the extra 20 cents per pound. And in 2004, there was such a strong demand from the growers to join fair trade that they actually stopped accepting applications for a period. They declared a moratorium. They just couldn't handle all the growers who wanted to join the network. Another thing that you may not know is that once you're in the network, so you've paid the $600 application fee and you're in, remember, all you get as a consumer in the United States when you go to the grocery store is you see that seal and you know what it means. Well, I mentioned earlier that Fair Trade International operates its own independent certifying organization that goes and visits these cooperatives of small coffee growers to make sure no kids are working there, the crop's not in a rainforest, everybody's paid at least the local minimum wage. They're making sure that all of that stuff happens. And that's expensive too, right? All that monitoring to make sure everybody's compliant. Who pays for that monitoring and compliance? The growers. So once you're in the Fair Trade Network and you paid your $600 to get in, the initial inspection, depending on how big the scale of your operation is, it might be $1,600 for the first inspection. It might be $3,500 for the first inspection. So think about that. You paid $600 to get in. Now you pay another couple $1,000 to be inspected the first year. And then the annual fees after that don't really change very much from those numbers that I've told you. So coffee growers are getting a guaranteed minimum, and they're offloading some risk onto the buyers on the other side of the network. But it's really expensive to continue to maintain your annual dues as a coffee grower and participate in the Fair Trade Coffee Network. There are also some weird distributional arrangements in terms of how coffee is sold across the globe. I did some checking before I came to give my talk with you guys. Tanzania, I think I mentioned, per capita income is about $500 per year. Let's take Peru. Peru, the annual income per person per year is about $5,000 or $6,000. Let's say $6,000. If you wanted to help the poorest people, wouldn't it make sense to buy most of your fair trade coffee from Tanzania, where the people are super poor? But that's not how it works. In fact, in one recent year, 25% of certified fair trade coffee came from Peru. 4% came from Tanzania. Yeah, why is this? Think about it. If you're Equal Exchange headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, and you know there are high-quality coffee growers in Peru who have been there for generations, where's the lower cost place to get the coffee beans that you need to be able to label them as certified, fair trade? It's in Peru and Mexico and Guatemala, places that by global standards are relatively rich compared to those coffee growers all the way over in Tanzania, where the costs of bringing those coffees to the United States are going to be prohibitively high. Another thing you may not know is just because you have a fair trade contract, so you paid the $600 and now you're paying, say, $3,000 a year for the annual monitoring. There's no guarantee, even if you find a buyer like Equal Exchange, that that buyer will take all of your crop that year and pay the extra 20 cents per pound. In fact, even the people who are super big fans of fair trade coffee, they'll confess that in a typical year, only about 35% of coffee grown by fair trade growers is actually purchased and labeled as fair trade coffee, and they don't then get the additional 20 cents per pound on everything else. So this is really interesting to me. If you had a cup of coffee today, and even if it wasn't labeled as fair trade coffee, it's very likely that it was grown by a fair trade coffee grower, but a fair trade coffee grower who couldn't sell it to his partner buyer on the other side of the market and ended up dumping that coffee into the conventional market. And then finally, we've been at fair trade coffee long enough that we can see whether there are results, and if there are, how those results turn out. The landmark study called the Hohenheim study, and you can Google that later if you want to check it out. It looked at coffee growers in Nicaragua, and it tracked them over 10 years. And they grew similar coffees in a similar region, and one group joined the Fair Trade Network and the other one did not. 10 years later, the coffee growers in the conventional market were actually better off than their fair trade counterparts. And the most obvious reason was that even though they had reduced risk, even though they joined the Fair Trade Network, paying that initial application fee and then the annual fees for monitoring and compliance, they simply couldn't recoup those costs every year in the form of higher prices for their coffee. So if that sounds like a gloomy note, let me make this a little more positive then. So next slide, fella. My advice to you as an economist and also as I think a good person is to, when you're trying to think about whether or not to buy fair trade coffee, go out and buy the coffee that tastes delicious to you, fits your budget best. And there are some really, really good reasons to do that. In my case, some of the coffee that I buy is fair trade, but I don't buy it because it's got the label on it. I buy it because it's great coffee. In fact, if you want to try a new one, try Equal Exchange's Organic Love Buzz. It is killer. It will knock you out. It's one of those coffees that even if it's already ground in the bag, it is still fantastic. So a little plug for Equal Exchange, Organic Love Buzz. But if you do that, right, if you buy coffee just like you buy everything else, you buy what you feel fits your needs best and that fits your budget best, then you'll have money left over because you won't be buying the fair trade coffee. So what could you do instead with the money that you're saving when you're not purchasing fair trade coffee? As an economist, I know what leads to long-term growth and development for the global poor. It's access to trade, access to trading partners, and then the ability to make and do stuff that they haven't been able to do before. And what are those things? They're things like capital, tools, machines, things you can use besides your own raw labor to make goods and services you haven't made before. What's another one? Education. And sometimes in the United States, we forget the things like basic language skills, basic math skills. They are really, really valuable in the increasingly global economy. And then finally, another thing we sometimes forget about is things like basic nutrition or clean drinking water. Have you ever been so hungry you couldn't think straight? That's what life is like for most of the global poor every single day. But if they weren't so hungry and they could think straight, they could be more productive as individuals. Right? They'd be better people, they'd be happier people, they'd be more productive. And we also take for granted even things like clean drinking water. My friend Feller gave me a bottle of water, Dasani. Oh, it's over there? See, I didn't even know where it is. In a lot of the developing world, they don't have clean, potable drinking water near where they live. So they spend a big portion, hours every day, transporting clean drinking water from the source to where their village is. So my suggestion is, if you want to do the right thing, drink the coffee you like that fits your budget best. And then, if you want to make a difference in the lives of the global poor, every time you pour that coffee, that's fair trade or not, put away a nickel or a dime or a quarter and collect those over time and then invest them in organizations that are working directly, not indirectly, but directly with the human beings that you're trying to help, and organizations that are making a direct investment in nutrition, microlending, education, all of these things that do have a transformative power on a human life. The other thing to keep in mind is this: every time that you spend $1 on fair trade coffee, that's $1 you're not spending on something else. So last slide. So keep this in mind. Even if you have a good heart, when you spend $1 on fair trade coffee, you should probably get $1's worth of value out of that charitable act. Right? That's the whole point. You're giving generously and you're paying extra for coffee, and maybe it's $1 extra. When you spend that $1 extra, that's $1 you don't have available to spend on anything else. You can't give it to any other charity. You can't spend it in your community where other people are working hard to try to earn a living and care for their families. So think carefully as a consumer. If you're a person of faith, think prayerfully as a consumer. And then make the life choice for you that seems to be the one that is honest with you, honest with your neighbors, and honest with the people that you're intending to help. Thanks very much, and we'll open it up for question and answer.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions.
I'm going to get my bottle of water.